Media Flailing and the dumbest bill in America. And this is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer on the other side of the camera. Welcome, everyone, to this podcast, an episode of Mark and the Millennials. It is called Old Media Flailing. Of course, we've all known that old media has been failing for a long time and flailing for a long time. But, of course, we wanted to just play with the words because we have talked about this before. The difference is we have some really new, funny stories about how badly they are flailing across the old media that's controlled, of course, by the left. But before we even go there, we have to follow up with a story that we did last podcast about California banning gasoline cars. Now, we had this as the dumbest bill in America. I believe it was the last podcast. And imagine that. You're California and you just want to ban gasoline cars altogether by 2035. Well, there's a new story out that's causing some small ripple, to say the least, in California. Get this, podcast listeners. In the Daily Caller, California tells residents not to charge electric vehicles because of blackouts a week after saying the state would ban gasoline cars. So, California residents are being told not to charge their electric vehicles due to possible blackouts just 1 week after the state of California said it was going to ban gasoline cars. So, in other words, you have an EV, you're doing all the things the state's telling you to do, and now you can't charge it because there is insufficient electricity on California's grid because they don't want to generate electricity from natural gas or from gasoline or from oil or from nuclear. Oh, no, it must be from wind and solar, which isn't quite cutting it in California. So you could very well be homebound in California because your EV can't be recharged and get you to where you want to go. The state of California issued a heat advisory Tuesday warning excessive heat will stress the energy grid. Well, look, every summer it's hot. And yes, some summers it's hotter than others. I know that. Sometimes you have really bad heat waves. I get that. But this is California after all. And the bottom line is that if you live in California, you were told your car is not going to be able to be driven because it's a gasoline car. At least by 2035, you're not going to be able to buy them, which means it's probably going to be really hard to find gasoline. And now suddenly you can't electrify your EV because there isn't enough. Look, folks, if you were trying to make up a story, okay, about how to ruin the largest state in the United States, and by all measures, probably the wealthiest state in the United States. I mean, California, of course, has produced amazing technologies in the new digital age. That is a fact, okay? They have Stanford University, just an incredible university that generates some of the best and brightest people in our country, great thinkers. And yet, this state, if you were to try to figure out a way to ruin a state, this is how you would do it. You would make it so that people would have insufficient energy to be able to conduct their daily lives. And so this is all over the news. And then in the meantime, of course, you have California saying, well, we're going to get rid of, gasoline cars. All of this is man-made. This entire crisis in California has been man-made. It has been made by policymakers who don't know what they're doing, don't know how to govern, and are pushing people and this once great state into the depths of depression, potentially, and they're pushing the people out of the state at the same time. And so we have to bring that up to you and just give you an update on the dumbest bill in America to prove how dumb it really is, because you have a state that bans gasoline cars and then a state that doesn't have enough electricity to generate for all of the EV vehicles because it's really hot this summer. Like, they didn't predict that? Come on. This has been going on for decades, okay? For decades in California. Obviously, for generations in California, you have hot summers. I know this. But for decades where the summers are hot and they seem incredibly, unbearably hot, and you need electricity to generate for what? Air conditioning. And then now you can't buy. I mean, I just don't understand this. Chris, help me out here. You're a millennial. I mean, help me. Help me. Help me understand this craziness. So old media is flailing, ladies and gentlemen. The Washington Post is losing money. And it's the first time that they've lost money since Trump left office, which tells you how valuable Donald Trump was for old media to keep them alive, because old media naturally has a complete head case about Donald Trump, and it really helps them sell newspapers. We all know this. So the Washington Post is reportedly on track to lose a substantial amount of money, and digital subscribers, meaning they're actually losing subscribers as well, since former President Donald Trump left office. The Post is expected to lose a large sum of its profitability in 2022 after several steady years of growth, which of course was from Trump, right? Trump got into office, and naturally the Post and the New York Times went out there and had all these crazy stories, which obviously some may have been true, some not, whatever. It didn't matter for the purposes of this discussion because it sold newspapers. And now that Trump's not in office, obviously what's happening? Well, they're losing money. So their ad revenue fell to $70 million. So it's down like 15% from the previous year. And the New York Times is absolutely having the same issue. The trend has evidently fallen upon news outlets after Trump left office in early 2021. Though the New York Times and Wall Street Journal have gained subscribers, the outlet reported, the New York Times, I'm sorry, I just find that really hard to believe that they have gained subscribers. And then the flailing media continues with Chuck Todd. So Chuck Todd is possibly on the chopping block over poor ratings. An executive for NBC News, Meet the Press, said it is reportedly deciding whether to replace Chuck Todd due to the show's declining ratings. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever watched Meet the Press, but Chuck Todd basically has people in his round table, and they're always agreeing with Chuck Todd. And from time to time, he'll have that token rhino Republican who's there to criticize Republicans rather than to critically talk about the issues. So as a result, it's basically groupthink on Meet the Press and has been for a very long time. And Chuck Todd's show is, of course, having ratings that fell by 21%, and therefore he is now on the chopping block. And then, of course, if that isn't enough, we have the New York Times. Okay, the New York Times, I just want to read some of the headlines from you guys. Now, I don't subscribe to the New York Times, but I do get their headline, on the so-called front page of their newspaper. I get that every single morning. And naturally, they'll give you a certain number of clicks to click through to read until such time as they try to hit you up for $1, right? For $1, you can read the New York Times for free for 90 days. And then after that, it's like, who knows, $300 probably. But here are some of the New York Times headlines. Podcast listeners, listen to this. This is just the last week. Good morning. We break down elected Republicans into 3 groups based on their stances toward false claims about the 2020 election: deniers, enablers, and acceptors. Now, if you are a reader of the New York Times or if you're a lefty, okay, if you lean left, you're probably reading the New York Times because you love these kinds of stories. And the New York Times is still putting these types of stories on their front page. This is just from this week. Okay. Again, here's the headline. We break down Republicans into 3 groups based on their stances toward false claims about the 2020 election: deniers, enablers, and acceptors. I mean, this is supposed to be a newspaper. This is the front page. I mean, in other words, they are editorializing on the front page. It's not even like a news story. It's something that they have decided is the case, the fact. And then here's another one. And every day, of course, it's Good Morning. Republican opposition to IRS funding is rooted in broader political goals. In other words, Republicans bad. That was the first story. Second story of the week, by the way, second morning. Front page, Republicans bad. Here's the third day. Florida's Republican governor is more conservative than the state's electorate, but he is embracing a hard right approach. That's the third day. That was the front page of the New York Times. And then the fourth day, President Biden's approach to his stutter highlights the stigma that the condition still brings. So remember, Biden, his entire administration is a dumpster fire. I mean, they are a complete joke. You have to laugh out loud when you hear Biden speak, and his policies make no sense. I'm sure most of you agree out there. And for example, the student loan debt, right, where you're transferring student loan debt from those who indebted themselves to go to college to all of those who did not go to college and or went to college but indeed paid off their loans. So you have the New York Times going, oh no, President Biden's approach to his own stutter highlights the stigma. It's like, I'm sorry, he's a big boy, okay? He's the president of the United States. Who cares about his stutter? What we care about is the policy and or the policies that he's implementing. But this is how the New York Times and the old media are flailing, because there really isn't news. It's all editorializing. And with the New York Times, of course, you heard the first three stories. You know, Republicans are bad. I think it was like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday's front page. And then the next front page was, oh, poor Biden, he stutters. Yeah, we didn't know that. And then, of course, I told you the other day that CNN is losing money, and that is no longer acceptable in the new CNN corporation. So CNN now has new leadership that's like, you know what? We need to start making money. So they fired Brian Stelter and canceled his show. What is it? New Day or something like that. They canceled his show. And so good old Brian Stelter is now out there looking for a job. I got to wonder who's going to hire him, you know? Reliable sources, yeah. Brian Stelter, can you imagine? A guy like Brian Stelter. Reliable sources. They're really reliable. Not confirmed sources, but reliable sources. And then we have the new media. A brand new story. I told you about the old media. We all know that it's flailing and failing, and they're doing everything they can to prop themselves up with anti-Republican stories and anti-Trump stories, and basically lumping all Republicans into one basket and saying they're terrible, or as Hillary Clinton said, the basket of deplorables. The new media, Google, actually denies letting Trump's social media company in its app store. Now, folks, this story is really not about Donald Trump as much as it is about the fact that if you have an app, your app should be permitted to be in the app stores, all of them, okay? It just should be. Especially an app that is nothing more than something that you click through and it allows you to post what you think about an issue or what you think about what's happening in your life or anything. You know, kind of like a Facebook daily kind of app or Instagram app, except that you actually have true free speech. You don't have people monitoring your speech. You don't have speech codes, which, of course, Trump's social media company does not have speech codes. You can actually say what you want to say. So Google is blocking Truth Social, which is Trump's media company, and Google is blocking it from its app store due to concerns over its content moderation. Trump started the app after Twitter banned him from his comments related to the Capitol riots on January 6, 2021, and Truth Social CEO Devin Nunes said the app was ready for Google Play App Store and pending approval last week. However, the company is requiring Truth Social to enforce stricter content moderation before it can be made available on Google Play, a Google spokesperson told The Hill. So here's the thing. It was necessary for Truth Social to actually build their own cloud computing facilities so that they could actually not be shut down. And they had to spend an enormous amount of money doing that. And Rumble has done the same thing. Okay. But the thing is, if you want the app, then you kind of need to go to an app store to get the app. I mean, obviously you can go to the website naturally. And but it's a little bit harder. An app store makes it much easier. And the new media knows that this is the case. So as a result, they're trying to put speech codes on what effectively is a free speech platform. And I know that we've all heard this before about how the existing social media companies and big tech companies are trying to continue speech codes. But what's interesting is now we finally have a free speech platform, and that free speech platform still, unfortunately, depends a certain degree on its accessibility of people to be able to download the app. Google knows this, Apple knows this, all the big tech companies know this, and they're trying to impose, even at this late stage in the game, speech codes. And so, podcast listeners, that's why I started out this podcast talking to you about how the Washington Post is losing money. They're all flailing. The New York Times headlines are a joke. Talk about one-sided. CNN is a joke. Chuck Todd is a joke. All these guys are losing an audience. And so big tech is trying to prevent the Republican voice from getting out there. We already know that old media was successfully stopping Republican voices from getting out there and being heard. And why is this important? It's important because when you have a state like California and you have big media that is preventing free speech from occurring about why it's so important to have all different kinds of energy sources competing against one another so that there is more than sufficient energy to drive and power the economy. When you don't have that freedom of speech, you have bad policies that prevail, such as banning gasoline cars and then having blackouts for your EV vehicle and maybe blackouts even for the air conditioning in your house during the hottest months of the year. And so this is just a new spin on it. You have this new platform, Rumble and Truth Social. These are two new platforms. While they're not combined, they've signed agreements with one another to mutually try to grow their platforms, a really good thing. But at the same time, you have to be able to get on those platforms easily in order for them to grow. And it's just fascinating how hard the left is working, along with big tech, to stop that growth from happening. It's the only way the left can continue to win national elections, is if they can stop your freedom of speech. So next up, podcast listeners, this is an incredible story about whipped cream. New York, okay, the state of New York has decided to ban anyone under age of 21 from buying whipped cream. That's right, you heard that correctly. If you are under 21, you cannot buy whipped cream in New York City. So in the New York Post, ID checks are required. In other words, you have to provide a photo ID in New York State anywhere you go when you buy whipped cream. And that is required throughout New York because it's a state law that just went into effect. So the state law was passed roughly a year ago. It just went into effect. And its concern is that teenagers are increasingly getting high by inhaling nitrous oxide used as a propellant in the canisters, the propellant to push out the whipped cream from Ready Whip or wherever. And so as a result, that's very dangerous. So you need a photo ID to prove that you're 21 years of age or older before you can buy whipped cream. Don't believe me, ladies and gentlemen. We have a clip on this from ABC 10 News in New York, and here is the clip.
Tonight's Fact or Fiction is brought to you by America's Finest Carpet.
In tonight's Fact or Fiction, we're looking into a story that caught our eye. It claims stores in New York are now requiring people to show their ID to buy whipped cream. And it's basically true. Under a state law, you must be at least 21 to buy whipped cream in a spray container in New York. The reason is the containers themselves. Young people are inhaling the nitrous oxide contained inside the canisters, also known as whippets. Anyone in New York caught selling whipped cream canisters to someone under 21 faces a $250 fine for the first offense. Whipped cream in a tub carries no age restriction.
So, whipped cream in a tub, like that Ready Whip that you open the plastic top off of and you just spin it. You don't need to be 21 to buy that. But you do need to be 21 with a photo ID to buy the whipped cream that's in the with the nitrous oxide, where it's just whatever, Ready Whip or whatever it's called. And you push the little nozzle and then it goes like that and it comes out. So here's my question. New York State, you don't require photo ID for people to vote, but you require photo ID for people to buy whipped cream. And the argument that the Democrats use in New York State, and they use this nationwide, mind you, and this is true, okay? The arguments that Democrats use against photo ID for voting is that black people are just so disadvantaged that they don't have photo IDs. Literally, that's what Democrats say. In fact, in Pennsylvania, the Democrat running for governor has said just that. That's why he opposes photo ID. So why doesn't that also apply to whipped cream? That people who are black are disadvantaged and can't find a photo ID to be able to buy whipped cream. And that's not fair. That's not equitable. How is that fair? So in the New York Post, I was reading the article and I went down to the comments section. And here's what some people have said. Pete Rosenthal, no whipped cream, but vapes, weed pens, and good old-fashioned marijuana is totally okay and legal. You can walk 5 feet in New York City without hitting a cloud of pot smoke or seeing a homeless shooting up. But I've yet to see anybody hitting whipped cream on the streets. Mr. Coffee says, that's better. New York is a place full of law-abiding citizens. If it weren't then New York streets would be littered with people passed out next to a half-empty can of whipped cream. And let me see, Noonie a busyness. Bingo, let's vilify whipped cream, but not the real drugs. Gotta love it. Gabby Gould. So if I'm under 21 years old, I would need to flash a photo ID in order to purchase a can of whipped cream in New York, but not to vote in a New York election. So there you go. So all of these comments are very similar to this. And it's just incredible, ladies and gentlemen, that in New York, you have people that are defecating on the street, shooting up on the street, and people that when you walk down the street, and this is happening in many places across America, you just smell weed everywhere, okay? And many of those individuals are clearly under 21. And you have people doing all this stuff, but we're not worried about the sanctity of our elections, much more worried about whipped cream. So make sure in New York, the next time you go there, you take your ID and you show them when you buy whipped cream at your local store. So next up, podcast listeners, cartels in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Cartels, I think actually the drug cartels are real in the city of Baltimore and in many cities across America. How do we know this? We know this because there is a concerted effort for carjackings, and we have all these young people who are being taught how to carjack and that they ought to be carjacking, but also an incredible story out of Baltimore. There's a high-profile TV show that was filming in Baltimore City, okay? It's a TV show, right? So you got a film crew, you got actors and actresses. The film crew had to stop filming after people in Baltimore City, the locals, if you will, threatened them and scared away the crew. And so here's the story. An upcoming show starring 2 well-known actresses was forced to stop production after an apparent extortion attempt on Friday. Producers for Lady in the Lake, a collaboration between Apple TV Plus and Endeavor Content, so obviously mega companies, was reportedly threatened by locals while filming near the block of 200 Park Avenue in Baltimore City, Maryland. In a statement, the police department of Baltimore City said the locals approached the producers of the show and said they would come back later in the evening and shoot someone. if the show did not stop filming. But the cartels in Baltimore that run the city gave the producers an option. You can continue to produce and film the show if you give us $50,000. I mean, it's a true story. This happened. This absolutely happened. So the leaders of the production decided to err on the side of caution and reschedule the shoot after they found another location. Baltimore Police Department spokeswoman Chakia Fenoy told The Times. Why does this matter? Because we have cartels in charge of an entire section of Baltimore City, Maryland, and the police, rather than cracking down on the control of the cartels in the city, have said, well, it might be better just to move your production. It would just be a lot safer. I'm not saying that the producers made the wrong decision. What I'm saying is, who's in charge of Baltimore City? And then in the Washington, D.C. area, in fact, in downtown Washington, D.C., Washington Commanders, which I have a hard time saying it. It was Washington Redskins, but now it's the Washington Commanders. Right back, Brian Robinson was hospitalized with non-life-threatening injuries after being shot because someone was trying to carjack him in Washington, D.C. So you have a professional football player that's on the former Washington Redskins, now called the Washington Commanders, Brian Robinson, who was peacefully driving his car in Northeast Washington, D.C. And what ended up happening? Well, he was shot and his car was taken because he was carjacked. So this is happening all across America. Then the cops fight back in New York City. So this is one of those must-watch videos because this is what happens when police officers are just tired of what's happening. So in New York City, the New York City Police Department, a video shows an NYPD cop basically flattening a woman who slapped him in the face. So the woman goes over to the cop, she slaps him in the face, and he just hauls off and hits her across the face. It slaps her, but really hard. And she just is out and falls flat on her back. But let me explain why the cop did that. It wasn't just because she slapped him in the face. It's because there was an explosive situation in New York City. So the incident unfolded Tuesday, shortly before 5 p.m. in the 174 West 136th Street, where police were arresting a 22-year-old man sought in connection with an attempted murder. So the police are trying to arrest a 22-year-old man whom they think tried to murder someone, to bring him in. And then you had some people who were saying, oh, no, you shouldn't arrest this guy. This is wrong. Cops. In other words, they're all trash talking the police officers, the NYPD. And then you have this, what appears to be a black woman, go and hit a black cop. Okay? A black cop. And the cop was pissed. Turns around, slaps her across the face really hard, and she falls flat on her back. Looked like she was out for maybe 2 or 3 seconds. And then you have the crowd that's trying to protect the 22-year-old potential murderer saying, oh, man, brother, you shouldn't have done that, brother. Oh, my God. So all I can say is the police are tired of this nonsense and they're protecting themselves, and no one should ever slap a cop. And I am thankful the cop slapped her back and knocked her on her ass. And this has to happen more. It's called discipline, right? I mean, these individuals are acting like they're absolute animals. I'm sorry, I'm saying it. And by the way, don't take my word for it. Watch this video that we're about to show you. If you're not watching the podcast, then listen to it, and you'll get a real good flavor of what's really happening. Here's the clip. Here it is.
is wilding. It's wilding, my nigga. You're wilding, bro. Why would you do that? Why would you do that, bro? Bro, why would you do that, bro? Come on, bro. Come on, bro. You hit up, man. Come on, bro. Let's go. Come on,
So that's one of the bystanders saying, come on, bro. And he's saying that to the black cop. Like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? She was just a kid. Well, it looked to me like, you know, this individual was 16 years old, I'm guessing, and goes over. Imagine your 16-year-old, ladies and gentlemen, your daughter or your son, doesn't matter. In this case, it was a woman, going over and slapping a cop as hard as they could right in the face. And then the cop slaps them back as hard as he could, at least at the moment, and she falls flat on her butt. I'm sorry, but what is the teaching moment when you don't teach people that they cannot disrespect the law enforcement officers? And so all I can say is, thankfully, in this case, in New York City, it was a black cop hitting a black woman. But keep in mind, this is the backdrop of all of these individuals just going crazy on the streets of New York when the cops are doing nothing more than trying to arrest a gentleman who they thought was trying to murder somebody. And bring him in for questioning. Maybe charge him. I'm not really sure. But this is what's happening in America across the country. You have in Baltimore City, the cartels that are in charge of entire portions and sections of the city of Baltimore. In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, a Washington Redskin, Washington Commanders football player is shot multiple times, and then his car is carjacked. And then in NYPD, you have individuals basically pushing back against the police who are trying to bring in a murderer or a potential murderer. Incredible stuff. And we can thank the Democrats for creating this mess in the city. We can thank the Democrats for creating a subclass that exists in the black community in the inner city to the point that these individuals are so dependent upon government that it's just the saddest thing that I've ever seen, how bad it has become in America's inner cities. And the Democrats own this because they run those inner cities. They run all of those cities. And by the way, the only city that I'm aware of in America, I'm talking about major city, that's not being run by Democrats is Miami. And that city is what? Flourishing. Imagine that. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the daily Biden dumpster fire. Yeah, that's correct. Joe Biden mocks the Second Amendment. He goes in front of a bunch of people and mocks the Second Amendment. He says that the military can obliterate the Second Amendment. So we have Young Americans for Liberty that tweet out, Joe Biden mocks patriots who correctly state the Second Amendment was written to allow the people to defend the nation from a tyrannical government. Quote, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something like that more than a gun, Biden says. In other words, you can't defeat the United States government if the government has become a tyrannical government unless you have a fighter jet, right? Not a gun, but a fighter jet, the F-15. We have that clip of the daily Biden dumpster fire, and here it is.
They're not unlimited. Right now, you can't go out and buy an automatic weapon. You can't go out and buy a cannon. And for those brave right-wing Americans who say it's all about keeping America's independent and safe, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun. No, I'm not joking. Think about this. Think about the rationale that's used to provide this, and who they shooting at. Shooting at these guys behind me.
So that's Joe Biden at a rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, promoting gun control and bolstering police forces across the nation because naturally the Biden administration, along with the other Democrats, have been canceling the police for 4 years. Suddenly they don't want to cancel the police. They want to expand the police, but they at the same time want to take away your ability to exercise your Second Amendment. And so what does Joe Biden say? He says that you have no business trying to challenge a tyrannical government And the only way you could do that anyway is if you had an F-15, because the government has F-15s. In other words, inferring that the United States government would use F-15s to bomb from the air its own people, and that you could never combat that with just regular guns. And that's why we need to take away your guns. What? Literally, that's what he's saying. I want to play this clip again for you. Listen to this really closely. Here it is.
They're not unlimited. Right now, you can't go out and buy an automatic weapon. You can't go out and buy a cannon. And for those brave right-wing Americans who say it's all about keeping America's independent and safe, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun. No, I'm not joking. Think about this. Think about the rationale we use that's used to provide this. And who are they shooting at? Shooting at these guys behind me.
So there you go. You got these guys. We're trying to protect these guys behind me. No, folks, we're not trying to protect just regular people behind Joe Biden who are Democrats. What we're trying to do is to educate folks that the Second Amendment was in place to protect the citizens from a government that could potentially and eventually become tyrannical. Maybe potentially a government that currently looks in some ways, not completely, but in some ways tyrannical today. So here's proof of the true purpose of the Second Amendment. And I have to thank our millennial, our podcast producer, Christopher Hopkins, for this. The Founding Fathers, listen closely, the Founding Fathers had one purpose in mind when they wrote the Second Amendment: to protect the citizenry from government. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote in a letter to James Madison the following, quote, "What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms." There you have it. You have Jefferson writing Madison that the purpose of the Second Amendment, its true purpose, is to remind the government that the people have the power and preserve the spirit and the ability to resist that government. And yet then you had Joe Biden in this daily dumpster fire of the daily Biden dumpster fire, Joe Biden saying in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, it doesn't matter anyway whether you have a Second Amendment. We've got F-15s. We'll bomb you from the sky. You would need an F-15 to be able to, take out the tyrannical government as it exists today. And then yet at the same time, he's at a rally talking about how they need to do what? Gun confiscation. Well, if you're not afraid of the guns because you have F-15s, then why are you trying to take away the guns? It's because the Democrat Party is truly a party that doesn't believe in the Second Amendment, and they don't believe, the Democrat Party does not believe that it's possible that a government from time to time might need to be reminded that it works for the citizens and not the other way around, and that a government receives its authority and authenticity and legitimacy from the consent of the citizens, not the other way around. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. And it's the dumbest bill in America. And it is California criminalizes COVID misinformation. That's right. California says it's illegal and you will go to prison if you say something bad about, the vaccine or anything else that California says is inappropriate about COVID. So this is real, ladies and gentlemen. I just want you to tell you, it was probably 6-7 months ago. We were talking about this bill. The bill has now passed one part of the legislature in California. So here it is. California's legislature just a couple of days ago passed a bill that would allow regulators to punish doctors for spreading misinformation and disinformation about COVID-19 vaccinations and treatments. AB 2098, that's the bill number, if signed by Democrat Governor Gavin Newsom, would designate spreading false or misleading medical information to patients as unprofessional conduct, subject to punishment by the Medical Board of California, which licenses doctors. In other words, if you're a doctor in California and you say to a patient, I don't think the vaccine is appropriate for you because you are 15 years old and you are the picture of health, and here's why I don't think you should have the vaccine. Here's the literature that I've read, and this backs up, but read it and make up your own mind. Guess what? That could be considered misinformation or disinformation, and you could have your license suspended and potentially not only never be able to practice medicine again, but you could also be sent to jail. 6-7 months ago, this bill had not passed the legislature. Between you guys and me, I never thought a bill like this would ever pass the legislature. I didn't think it was possible. Okay? But it has, and now it's on Governor Newsom's desk. What is he going to do? We have a clip from the news there. Here it is. Listen.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Powell. Californians for Good Governance opposes AB 2098 because it can't achieve its stated goals without violating the Constitution. The First Amendment does not allow broad, content-based restrictions on speech, even if that speech is false, even if the intent of the law is compelling. Among the constitutional problems with this bill would be the chilling effect it would have on speech. It would cause conscientious doctors to censor themselves. The remedy for speech that is false is speech that is true. This is not an abstract ideal we aspire to. This is the only way you sort fact from fiction in a free society. We don't need this bill because there's no misinformation crisis. There's a crisis of institutional credibility. The public has lost faith in the medical establishment, and censorship will not rebuild that trust. In fact, it's the surest way to further erode that trust. Thank you, and I'd like to give the rest of the time to Dr. Karen.
And to be clear, that was testimony in front of the California legislature against the bill that says you can lose your medical license if you provide disinformation or misinformation. And of course, who's going to determine what disinformation and misinformation is or isn't? Oh, of course, it's going to be the politicians. So much for free speech in California when it comes to saying, no, I don't want a vaccine because it hasn't been, approved by the FDA. Because it hasn't. It's under an emergency use authorization. If it were actually approved, it would be stamped approved. But it's not. And so why does this matter? Well, because the Biden administration tried to create and successfully created, but hasn't staffed, as far as I know, a disinformation governance board. We talked about that a few months ago, right? The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, would have the disinformation governance board under it so as to fight misinformation. And of course, there was so much pushback against this because of the, free speech clause in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Why? Because you get to say what you want to say. You get to disagree. You get to decide the medicine that you do and don't want to take. That's just the way it is, okay? I'm sorry, Democrats. And so that apparently did not go over very well with the Biden administration because the person that was going to head it decided that, this just isn't worth the fight. Maybe we can try this some other time when people aren't actually watching and when we can actually control the media so that they don't actually report what we're trying to do to you. And then, of course, you have the FBI going to Mark Zuckerberg saying, you know what? Yeah, that laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop, that was disinformation from the Russians. That's your government doing this. And now in California, they're like, oh, yeah, well, if you spread COVID misinformation or disinformation, you're going to lose your right to practice medicine in California. And we could potentially even put you in jail and prison. This is so dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, right? The once great state of California, the state that believed of any state in free speech to say whatever you want, right? Anything you want to say, is now trying to have speech codes, which of course already exist in the colleges there in California, very much so, but speech codes in medicine, a place where you're supposed to freely talk about all the potential ways that you can get better and find all the different ideas and new ideas and share ideas. and just try to make your life, not allowed anymore. It's disinformation. That's misinformation. Take the vaccine and shut up. And that's the dumbest bill in America. California criminalizes COVID misinformation. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, True Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.